Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. May I take this opportunity to welcome you all, those of us who are on site and our friends and colleagues online. It's another afternoon, Thursday the 20th, that we're having our seminar. Today, Kambi Gathesha is going to speak about the source of the knowledge river, African-American imaginings, engagements, and the birth of African studies, 1850 to 1930. Gathesha is a PhD student at Columbia University and a Fulbright Fellowship Research Grant holder. He is currently a research affiliate at the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Nairobi. Gathesha's research focuses on the diffusion of African dance and the performance traditions in the diaspora, utilizing historical linguistics to analyze linguistic evidence as testimony. Welcome, Gathesha. Our discussant to Gathesha's paper is Ngala Chome, Dr. Ngala Chome. Dr. Ngala Chome has been associated with the Department of History and Archaeology for a long time. Currently, he's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ghent in Belgium. Welcome, Dr. Chome. Dr. Chome, I would want to add, is our product from undergraduate days, and we're very proud to have him with us this afternoon. Without much ado, welcome again. I want to welcome Gathesha to give your presentation. You have 1 hour. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and good afternoon to the people who are joining us in the virtual space. I just want to say just a few introductory remarks, and then I'll continue. So first off, this is a bit of a quick clarifying point. So I'll actually be beginning my PhD studies in the fall, hoping to follow in the footsteps. But this is a bit of a homecoming for me. I'm from the region, even though I did my schooling, some of it outside of Kenya. My father actually did his undergraduate here many years ago. So this is a bit of a homecoming, and it's been an amazing intellectual space to work with Professor Gona and Professor Ombongi as well. So this project, I just want to preface it by saying, is ongoing, and so I'm really looking forward to the discussion with Ngala. I'm really excited to hear your questions and your feedback because I'm still developing these ideas. So there are a couple of preambles here, so just indulge me. And if I could go, I'll keep this slide here. So I just want to offer a quick introductory note, and then I'll get into what I want to discuss today. So on October 4th, 1922, Howard University President Stanley Durkee, and for context, Howard University is not only critical for this project, but very critical in the larger story of African-American, and I would also say Afro-diasporic community building and intellectual networks. Nonetheless, on October 4th, 1922, Howard University President Stanley Durkee, who at the time was the latest in a long line of white male clergy leaders of Black colleges and universities in the United States, delivered his yearly welcome address of the winter quarter. The embattled president, whose tenure was often marked with tense standoffs between he and the student body, asserted in his speech that he knew that Black students had, and I quote, racial problems which tax your mind and your heart, such as refuting the pernicious myth that declared that the racial group of which we at Howard represent had no past history save of that of ignorance and servitude, end quote. After his speech, President Durkee had ushered onto the stage the university's newest faculty hire, the African-American, Harvard-educated child of the Deep South, Professor William Leo Hansberry. After introducing Hansberry to the campus community as, and I quote, among the foremost investigators of the history of the race, end quote, President Durkee, echoing what was a growing campus sentiment, urged the students to combat propaganda against the, quote, American Negro, by taking Professor Hansberry's classes in the history showing the great civilizations of ancient Africa in the long past, built up and maintained by the race of which you are a proud representative, end quote. Though Howard University had hired pioneering historian Carter G. Woodson just 3 years prior in 1919, I would actually submit that the arrival of Professor Hansberry to campus in 1922 marked the official beginning of the formal study of Africa in North America. And the story of how we get to this point, the story of how we get to the beginning of the founding of this field, which is which this particular archive of the field is prevalent in North America and Western Europe, is really what I'm concerned with. So the origins of this intellectual history. And so this talk, as Professor Gona mentioned, is an extract from a much larger project I'm working on titled The Source of the Knowledge River, which looks at the communities and the ideas that circulated together to really birth this field. And the talk that I'm going to be giving this afternoon is actually an excerpt of chapter 1, which is titled, if you could go back to the initial slide, the first one, please. Which is titled Mother Africa's Outstretched Arms, Religiosity, Citizenship, and the Roots of Africa Consciousness from 1830 to 1900. And in this particular talk, while my overall project is concerned with the 20th century development of the field, part of what I want to argue is that it is almost impossible to understand the trajectory of African studies, whether it is the constant appeals to ancient Egypt, the ideas of African civilization, the ideas of African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans being the descendants of people in Africa. I think it's impossible to understand why these ideas have resonance and why they have been the foundation of various African studies archives without looking at what was going on in the 19th century, both in the intellectual arena, the growing sort of university arena, and the popular spaces that African Americans were building for themselves. And so 2 points that I want to make as I talk to sort of frame this discussion is that when we often talk about the origins of the field, we often frame those as an intellectual history. And what I want to submit is that while that is the case, and while that is certainly the frame that I'm using in my talk, I also want to throw out another concept, which is that this is not only an intellectual history, i.e. looking at the birth of the field, but I also think it's a social history. And what that means is that the intellectual was never divorced from the political, the intellectual and the political was never divorced from the community. That these intellectuals and these early scholars were not developing ideas in a vacuum, but were actually in a dialectic with the popular masses. And so it's an intellectual history as much as it is a social history. The second point that I want to make is that when we talk about African studies, we are really talking about two concepts, in my opinion. I think we're talking about hegemony, and we're talking about an invisibility. And to that, if we could move to... Yes, move to the second slide, please. So in the university, we have this fancy term called the racial politics of knowledge production on Africa. And what I want to do is talk about sort of the intervention that I think my work tries to make and the particular hegemony that I'm responding to and the particular invisibility that I hope my work addresses. So in the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union are engaged in a global jostling for power and for influence. One of the casualties of the Cold War was the way in which African studies and more broadly speaking, scholarship becomes intertwined in this sort of global battle for hegemony. Prior to the 1950s, African studies as we know it today was really anchored in one place, the historically Black university and college. Howard University in Washington, D.C., Lincoln and Fisk universities in the American South. In the late 1940s and the 1950s, what had been a popular mass Black diasporic-led field begins to change hands, not only racially, but institutionally. What was once a democratic and working class intellectual field of study was now in the hands of entities like the State Department and the growing, what we would call white research university or the R1 university, most notably Northwestern University in Illinois, the University of Wisconsin at Madison. What this does is it creates an hegemony, creates an invisibility, and what I would call racializes the field of study. As a response to this state of affairs, a growing insurgent body of scholars led by, if we could go to, please, the sixth slide. Yes, please. Thank you so much. Led by figures like John Henry Clark and public colleges in the northeast of the United States begin to wage an assault on what they perceive to be the racializing of the field, which not only stymied how Africa was talked about, but really sort of codified who gets to speak about Africa. As a result, research on the origins of African studies has really been limited to the 1950s, the 1960s, 70s, and so on and so forth. And consequently, while I do think it's important to address that history, what has gone understudied is what this earlier period was. And so while people do make cursory reference to a lot of these early African American and Caribbean and African pioneers of the field, really teasing into what they were saying, how they were saying it, and who they were in conversation with is woefully understudied. And so that is where I find myself in this project and what I will talk about in just a second. So, in my project as a whole, I argue that in response to protracted assaults on African American life and liberty, Black race leaders like clergy, abolitionists, journalists, and later the first generation of formally trained African American historians, as well as self-taught bibliophiles, first engaged in the historical recovery of African pasts. And this is very critical as a part of a broader vision of Black freedom. What that means is that the field was never meant to be merely an academic enterprise, but was instead a popular, mass-based, diasporic, political, and intellectual project in which the architects of the field connected the production of knowledge on Africa to a broader vision of Black emancipation. In this history, there are two critical categories of historical actors. The first being the first generation of formally trained African American historians like, slide number 7, please. Like Carter G. Woodson, W.E.B. Bois, and William Leo Hansberry. Equally important to this narrative of creating infrastructure are the working class self-trained historians, many of whom did not have a formal education, but who presented a really robust challenge to the information that was being produced in the academy. Together, the movement in the streets and the movement in the academy presented a history of Africa that was not just limited to the United States, but also included and created the concept of a diaspora. In this excerpt, which takes up portions of chapter 1 of my thesis, I locate the origins of 20th century African studies, both in the university and in the popular arena within 19th century African American institutions, most notably the Black Church on the one hand, and the Black Literary Society. These two spaces became the critical sites of knowledge production on Africa. And in the context of this 19th century foundational period of African historiography, we find that appeals to Africa were really articulated through Christian religious theology. The Black theologian scholar like Reverend Alexander Crummell, Reverend Henry Highland Garnet, and Reverend Edward Blyden fashioned an Africa that needed salvation from the continent's more enlightened brethren across the Atlantic. During this critical period, Africa was imagined as a Black Zion, whereby African Americans could both seek refuge from American racism and also exercise a level of agency that they could not in the United States or the broader imperial core. And the point that I want to make here is that as we think about and discuss this dialectic between African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Africans, not only is it a long-standing relationship, but it is a relationship that has articulated itself differently at different times. That is to say, at certain moments, it's been incredibly productive, and at certain moments, it has had all sorts of interesting to problematic contradictions, which I'll address a little bit, and I think really are worth thinking about. But despite the sort of uneven dialectic that we see with these different communities, I think the broader point is that there's no real way to understand this diasporic intellectual tradition without engaging African American intellectual history and without taking Africa seriously. So that is to say that Africa really lies at the heart of an African American intellectual tradition. So in 1856, while studying to become a clergyman in Monrovia, Liberia, the West Indian intellectual and future Pan-Africanist leader Edward Wilmot Blyden published his scholarly pamphlet, A Voice from Bleeding Africa. In it, Blyden argued that Africa and its people were not inherently a lesser people, but were disparaged in the public imagination as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Serious effects of slavery, he argued, had caused, I quote, irreconcilable feuds among the people, end quote, which resulted in not only weakened social ties, but in an ambiguous relationship to the mother continent from the burgeoning slave population. Blyden also argued that race was the foundation of any intragroup unity, and that, and I quote, the redemption of Africa and the elevation of its brethren across the Atlantic were intertwined and could be achieved together. This collective liberation, he posited, needed a literate class of Black people that resolved to, and I quote, no longer stand aloof from the people of Liberia, and here Liberia is functioning as a proxy for the broader Africa, but could instead coalesce around it as a refuge for the oppressed of the African race. As a theologian and as a scholar, Reverend Blyden was a representative of other 19th century Black leaders who themselves wrote revisionist African histories meant to energize and mobilize the Black public in the face of worsening conditions for African Americans in the antebellum period. In 1860, Reverend Blyden, who was by then an internationally recognized theologian, scholar who was 7 years into a professorship, and who was also the Secretary of State of Liberia, published his first full-length scholarly book titled The Negro in Ancient History. Like his earlier pamphlet, this book was a collective history that joined together Africans and, I quote, the American Negro in a singular historical narrative. He wrote, and I quote, that all Negroes had their origin at the heads of the waters of the Nile, and that they had left evidence of African ingenuity on the banks of the Gambia to the neighborhood of the Zaire. Methodologically, Blyden had used scripture like the 10th chapter of Genesis, as well as written testimony from ancient writers like Homer to Herodotus to bolster his claim that Africans and their brethren, the American Negro, were the chosen people that God had watched over and had preserved for some great purpose. The race of Negroes, he wrote, who at present were slaves and objects of our extreme contempt, were in actuality the ones who had built the pyramids, furnished the world with arts and sciences, and who were indeed the architects of the wonders of Egypt and Ethiopia. Blyden and his contemporaries, like Reverend Alexander Crummell of New York City, Reverend Henry Highland Garnet of the broader Northeast, and the abolitionist Martin Delany, who began his career both in Philadelphia and in Delaware, both in the Northeast of the United States, were joined together in this paradigm. Their arguments, I would argue, shaped the trajectory of African American and diaspora-led knowledge production on Africa, both in the university and in the popular arena for the next century. Through religious notions of providence or destiny, this growing Black intelligentsia made Africa and African American freedom codependent by issuing a joint promise that through diasporic engagement up to and including emigration to Liberia, and again, Liberia is functioning as a proxy for all of Africa, Africa would, and I quote, experience an awakening, and that princes shall come out of Egypt, and critically, that Ethiopia shall stretch out her bleeding hands abroad unto the degraded African American with the cry of agony, taking all of them up to the throne of God. These theologians, scholars, and abolitionists engaged Africa singularly through the lens of antiquity and very critically through the lens of civilization. And this is where I think the contradictions in terms of this intellectual history really articulate themselves, because these appeals were uneven. And what I mean by that is that on one hand, they were making an appeal to the glory of Africa's ancient past. And so while they made the claim that African civilization, African antiquity was worth elevating, their notions of contemporary Africa were such that Africa was developmentally stagnant. And so this is a contradiction that is never really reconciled in the literature, but I think is worth really thinking about. On one hand, you have this growing body of an intelligentsia that's making an argument that Africa is not only essential intellectually, but is the foundation of a broader freedom movement, but they're keeping it stuck in the past and not really engaging with Africa as a dynamic place that is very much contemporary. And I think this is something that I really want us to think about as the talk goes on, and I think even through the Q&A. Within this history, this 19th century period, two critical sites emerge: the African American Church and the African American Literary Society, both responses to worsening conditions for African Americans in the antebellum period, and both were sites of not only African American identity formation, but on African American knowledge production on the African continent. And I think a critical thing that is worth thinking about is that during this period, in a sense, I would also say this is true for the diaspora scholars, to a certain extent, everyone is imagining Africa in their own way. Whether Liberia is a proxy for Africa, or Egypt or Ethiopia, there's a way in which there's not only intellectual work happening, but I would also say that there's a lot of creative work happening, that this is also a period of creative writing. Yeah. During the late 18th and 19th centuries, enslaved African self-perception shifted under the sociocultural transformations that accompanied subjugation. Some were estranged from and oftentimes ashamed of their African roots, while others viewed themselves as children of the African soil. As the New York City-based historian Michael Gomez has noted, one factor that informed this ambiguous relationship to the African continent was one's place of birth. As we move from the antebellum period into the postbellum period, we witness a demographic shift that has really interesting consequences for how the slave population begins to relate to the African continent. The African parents, the slave population who can trace their birth to the African continent, wouldn't have experienced the same ambivalence as their children who were born on American soil. By the early 19th century, abolitionist texts too had emphasized social difference in an already heterogeneous enslaved population by insisting that African-born slaves were more rebellious than their American-born counterparts and were thus more threatening to the stability of the slave system. Consequently, I would say that the enslaved population's intragroup relations begin to fracture and become contentious. This not only has consequences for how slaves themselves are relating to each other, but also has really interesting consequences for how people relate to the quote-unquote the mother country. Prominent theologians like Alexander Crummell, Garnett, and abolitionists like Delaney come of age against this backdrop. It was Reverend Crummell himself, who was born a free black man in 1819 in New York City, who was really one of the early forerunners of this history. He, along with Garnett, who had escaped slavery, attended the Africa Free School, which was founded in New York City. This school played a critical role in the formation and the consciousness building specifically of the youth. The school, founded in 1787 after the organization of the Manumission Society for the purposes of educating children of the injured and long degraded race. In addition to courses on spelling, reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and elocution, students also received religious instruction. Through religious instruction, students like Crummell, like Garnett, and others first encountered the imagery and the ideas of Egypt and of Ethiopia. Student-driven writings at the school demonstrated early notions of a conjoined redemption for both the enslaved population and for Africa. For instance, in May 1824, during the school's annual examination, one of the students elected to deliver a poem on abolition in front of the student body. In his address, the young pupil wrote, and I quote, "O Africa, land of my fathers, my heart bleeds for thy children," end quote. He continued, "The oracle of authority proclaimed thy chains are broken, that Africa be free." This young student had assured his brethren that members of, quote, our injured race could stand firm in the knowledge that Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands unto God, and that the cause of Africa is rising in prayer. These children of the enslaved and of the freeborn interpreted scripture in such a way as to provide a moral basis for their calls for freedom. In so doing, they found redemption in the promise of Eden in Africa. Thus, Africa consciousness building and African American freedom were inextricably linked, both intellectually and morally. Africa consciousness also extended outside the gates of the school to the broader Black community. The free Black community in which Crummell and his family lived had a population of about 14,000 by 1830. In addition to the roles of the schools in which these future leaders attended, the neighborhood itself was a critical site of consciousness building. In these neighborhoods, news of growing slave rebellions stoked the imagination of these young people who were desperate to have some kind of connection with the mother continent. One example is the Nat Turner Uprising of 1830. Within this context of worsening conditions for African Americans across the nation, cities like Philadelphia in the northeast of the United States were fast becoming centers of violence, with institutional manifestations of Black industry like churches and such being targets for racial violence. This state of affairs put directly the question of Black citizenship and Black belonging before the public. And in this sort of questioning to determine the place of African Americans in the body politic in the United States, Africa begins to take on even more resonance. And it is here that we encounter a very critical space that had consequences for how African Americans and those of the diaspora would relate to the continent for the next 50 years of the 19th century, intellectually and politically. The American Colonization Society, formed by an elite group of white men in 1816, was an effort designed to send free African Americans outside the United States. The society's members included planters and political leaders from the Upper South and had received financial support from private philanthropy and federal funds. the result of which was the establishment of the West African colony of Liberia, whose first Secretary of State and leader was the West Indian intellectual Edward Blyden. Initially, the gradual abolition of slavery in the North did not contain a provision for slavery. However, the rapid growth of the free Black population eventually moved believers in a white America towards a policy of removal. And this is a really contentious and critical point in sort of Americanist historiography, is as we move from the end of the Civil War, is the Civil War really a period of emancipation for African Americans if the prevailing idea was that yes, slavery will be abolished, but that doesn't mean that African Americans will have a place in our society. And this is the question that African American intellectuals, literary figures, and ordinary everyday people are wrestling with. And it is within this jockeying that scholarly, imaginative, creative writings about Africa begin to flourish. In 1825, the American Colonization Society established a monthly newspaper to promote African American immigration to Liberia and then later Sierra Leone. The articles rhetorically undermined stereotypes of African backwardness. However, the rhetoric represented what I would call a cynical strategy meant to bolster African American interest in Africa in order to entice that population towards Africa and away from the United States. The American Colonization Society further argued that colonization promised to extinguish the slave trade and permit legitimate commerce, as well as introduce civilization and Christianity into Africa. During the rise of the ACS, African Americans actively asserted America as the land of their birthright citizenship and equality before the land. However, the ACS, the American Colonization Society, referred to the Black population as the exiled children of Africa and not as Americans. And while some African Americans shared the perspective of the colonization movement, many resisted calls for removal. In 1817, for instance, nearly 3,000 Black Philadelphians convened a meeting in Philadelphia at the Bethel Church to discuss the issue of colonization efforts. And it is within this context of Black self-organization that we get to the next theme of my talk, which is the rise of the Black church and the rise of the Black literary society as what I would consider the earliest sort of modern intellectual space that predates the university. Founded in Philadelphia in 1862 in response to Black and Native American exclusion from white Episcopal churches which were growing in the urban northeast of the United States, the African Methodist Church, popularly known as the AME, was established to, quote, refute the slander that colored men were incapable of self-government and of self-support. The AME instead contended that the Negro, quote, did possess an independence of character. Black theologian scholars argued that recording history was critical and was an extension of Christian duty. According to the AME founder, Reverend Daniel Payne, to be a historian of one's past was a divine calling that, and I quote, exalteth the individual and the nation. Payne, like Blyden and others of his time, also made the point that history stifled those canonizing falsehoods and lies with documentation which would prove irrefutable under scrutiny. And if you look at the sign there, this idea that to know history is to know yourself has resonance today. The rise of the church and the Black theologian scholar as the predominant race leader of the time can also be explained by the critical role that religious figures, Black male religious figures, and I do hope that during the question and answer session, the question of gender comes up because I think it appears in very interesting, if not invisible ways. But I want to be clear, these male religious leaders were critical in Black insurrections. For example, in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a 55-year-old seafarer from either Africa or the West Indies, we're not really sure, launched a slave rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina on the coast of eastern United States. After planning an extensive rebellion, it was ultimately put down. According to the journalist and abolitionist Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who traveled to Charleston in June of 1861 to write an article on Vesey and his trial for the Atlantic Monthly, Vesey himself was a zealot, a Bible teaching organizer of the South who built a foundation for his insurrection out of weekly church meetings that took place in this growing Black church. In the ensuing legal proceeding following Vesey's insurrection, 35 African Americans were hanged, while at least 43 were deported to either Africa or the Caribbean. Notably, most, if not all, of the leaders of the revolt were also religious instructors in other AME chapters across the United States, most notably South Carolina, Philadelphia, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York City. Vesey's case provides an example of how, through the appropriation of scripture in the context of Black revolt, the theologian became a race leader and the church became a counter-hegemonic site of Africa consciousness building. African American literary societies played an equally critical role as the Black church in fostering an academic, intellectual, and emotional connection and interest of Africa among the population. These Black literary societies were initially established between 1820 and 1830, most prominently in the Northeast, by free Blacks in the urban North as a means of acquiring knowledge and engaging with a broad Black public that included the literate and the semi-literate. As the literary scholar Elizabeth McHenry has argued, these were not only social spaces, but were intellectual spaces. One of the most important of these literary societies was the Bethel Literary and Historical Association, founded just a few miles from actually where I went to high school in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. journalist and founder of the African-American newspaper People's Advocate, John Cromwell, who himself was a regular attendant at these meetings, recalled that at Bethel, papers were presented on topics such as Who Were the Ancient Egyptians? By Howard University graduate student Reverend A.W. Shaw, The Racial Connections of the Zulus by Reverend R.M. Cheeks, and a paper titled The Ethiopians, Who Were They? Presented by Cromwell himself. Cromwell wrote that those papers represented a, quote, new movement towards the enlightenment of the people. One final point I want to make in terms of the sources of consciousness building is the important role of literacy and the important role of newspapers. The reason the church sticks out to me as a site that's worth thinking about is that in a sense, Black churches were refuges for different sectors of the African-American population. Newspapers catered, in contrast, newspapers catered to a very specific cohort of African Americans in this period, those who, generally speaking, were hyper-educated, and those who were, by definition, who were literate. These papers were nonetheless incredibly crucial in disseminating ideas about how we should be thinking about Africa in this period. One of the most consequential of these papers was the Freedom's Journal. The first African-American newspaper, Freedom's Journal, was founded in 1827 by both the Caribbean-born immigrant John Russwurm and the African-American free-born and fellow graduate of the Africa Free School in New York City, Samuel Cornish. The paper was devoted to the improvement of, quote, the colored population and became a, quote, important resource for newly literate readers, even becoming a primary text in the libraries of local reading rooms and other literary societies. For most of the paper's short life, Russwurm ran stories dealing with Africa. Some were general interest stories, others were historical articles. For instance, one particular article authored on August 24th, 1827, ran a historical article titled African Genealogy, which addressed the topic of the peopling of other parts of the world. Using ancient sources like the testimony of writers like Herodotus, Homer, and others, the article argued that, once again, becoming a familiar refrain, the ancient Egyptians were the first inhabitants of the earth. He goes on to say that the peopling of the globe was explained by the invasion of the king shepherds, who themselves were descendants of the wicked Cush. Another article, authored on May 18th, 1827, argued that ran a story detailing the deciphering of the ancient hieroglyphics. Yet another article written on August 31st, 1827, argued that any plan which implies in our brethren or their descendants inferiority cannot be raised to respectable standing, and that we are at war with our best interests if we neglect the mother country. The mother country, of course, being Liberia, which is a proxy for Africa. Beyond African consciousness building, and I think this is really critical, Russwurm helped forge a broader diaspora sensibility by incorporating the voice of the diaspora of the Caribbean, most notably Haiti. In an article written on February 7th, 1829, the work of the Haitian political writer and statesman Baron de Vassy was featured in a front page cover story. Vassie had written extensively on slavery, arguing that the institution had confounded the meaning of revolution for the world. Vassie often linked Haiti's history with the United States, and in his article titled Africa, he wrote in a familiar vein that the enemies of Africa wish to persuade the world that Africa has always been sunk in barbarism and backwardsness, and that such sentiments were indisputably falsehoods. Vassie asked that if those espousing bigoted ideas, have they forgotten that Africa was once the cradle of the arts and sciences? In that, Vassie was part of a burgeoning tradition that predated even Edward Blyden. He too, like Blyden and others, appropriated scripture, namely from Psalm 68:31, that spoke of a prophecy that Africa would eventually experience an awakening. Religious appropriation is only one explanation for the enduring appeal of Egypt, as a proxy for Africa. Another reason had to do, quite frankly, with class biases. And this is another contradiction and another tension that I think continues to articulate itself today. Part of the reason I would submit that Egypt becomes so important in the imagining of Africa and what it is and what it can be, I think has to do with what we consider to be markers of civilization. And so, in a sense, one could say that these leaders did write alongside the grain as much as they wrote against it, which is to say that they undermined Eurocentric ideas of Africa as much as they reinforced that ideas by arguing that civilization could only look one way, that civilization involves centralized kingdoms, stratification, pyramids, written languages, and the like. And it's this tension that I think creates a really interesting conversation that I hope we can get into later. For Blyden, Cromel, and others, claiming Egypt mattered because of its material features. This 19th century cohort went alongside the grain as much as it went against it in these proto-scholarly arguments. And as I come to the sort of close of my preliminary remarks, what I want to touch on now is this sort of late century transition from religious appeals to the African continent to now the growth of a relationship between religious invocation in scripture and the growing social sciences. So if the first half of the 19th century could be considered the growth of independent Black institutions, the sort of African-American and Afro-Caribbean appropriation of Christian theology and scripture, then the second half of the 19th century, I think, can be understood as a period where you start to see the coming together of the growing social sciences, what we today call the disciplines, ethnology, anthropology, linguistics, proto-history, and the enduring appeal of Christianity coming together to create a very hegemonic idea of how Africa should be spoken. And to sort of touch on these ideas, I want to speak on a really critical event that took place in the United States, in Illinois, at the tail end of the 19th century. As the century drew to a close, the religious arena and the scientific realm intersected, further circumscribing Africa epistemologically. In 1895, against the backdrop of the growing European scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference, which had taken place just 10 years prior in 1885, the Ohio-based reverend and one-time trustee of Northwestern University, W.M.F. Stewart, and his Missionary Foundation for Africa convened the Congress on Africa in central Illinois. Many of the speakers and organizers present were the heads of universities and, very critically, were the heads of their own churches scattered across the United States. They represented bishops, educators, and eventual university presidents, like the first president of the historically Black college and university, Howard University. Each concentrated their remarks at this Congress on the American Negro, encouraging them to have a greater involvement in escalating missionary work on the continent. Race once again articulated itself and was critical rhetorically at this Congress and would shape the scholarly perception of Africa henceforth. For instance, traveler and philologist Heli Chatelain appeared at the Congress and delivered an address in which he segmented Africa into races. He argued that the world was made of races and racial categories, and that each race had an essential quality. And so when we think about patterns in the university today, I can't really speak for dynamics outside the United States, but certainly within the United States, for those who have taken humanities courses there, one of the very curious things you'll find is that very mysteriously, there's this thing called sub-Saharan Africa, which tends to exclude everything north of that. And what some academics refer to it as a sort of intellectual and epistemological dividing of the African continent. I would submit that a lot of this work really begins in this crucial period as the Europeans begin their first scramble into the continent for resources. Chatelain differed from Blyden in one important respect. He racialized and segmented Africa by claiming that the Arabs, even North Africa, represented the white race and that Negroes represented the rest of the continent. Whereas Black leaders of the time wrote about Africa in a holistic fashion, including Liberia, Egypt, Ethiopia, and as far south as South Africa, this new cohort of racialized scholarship had begun to segment the continent. This would have deleterious consequences that reverberate throughout the 20th century, and I would submit reverberate today. At the end of the 19th century, the African and African American dialectic had many dimensions. The relationship was imbued simultaneously with disparagement and longing. One's place of origin, along with religious imagery, political shifts, grassroots institutions, and geopolitical alignments informed rhetoric, which in turn affected attitudes towards Africa. The Congress of Africa represented a critical intersection, linking religiosity with social science logic. The first generation of formally trained African-American scholars who came to prominence at the twilight of the 19th century and at the dawn of the 20th century would inherit this intellectual tradition of the Black theologian scholar and undermine the logic of the colonial sciences. By the end of the 19th century, W.E.B. Du Bois would earn his PhD from Harvard, becoming the first African-American to do so. Carter G. Woodson would follow in his footsteps of becoming, to this day, the first and only person of slave parentage to earn a PhD in the United States. And William Leo Hansberry would just have been born. The period of religiously informed knowledge production ceded ground to what I call a secular intellectual landscape represented by these aforementioned figures. They stood on the intellectual shoulders of their 19th century predecessors and began a militant march to the university. Thank you.
Another round of applause. Thank you very much for your presentation. I call upon Dr. Ngala Chome to discuss Gathesha's paper. Thank you.
Thank you again, Kambi. That was very enriching. And I mean, I was trying to organize my thoughts around maybe 2 or 3 overarching ideas around which, you know, the discussion that will come after could follow, or even questions could come after that. I was really struck by this idea of the romanticization, if you like, of the glorious African past that you allude was also very much a concern of early African-American intellectual traditions. My sort of curiosity in your work is you know, not disagreeing that, you know, this has been a tradition. I think it also kind of develops develops in the 20th century as well. Do you pay attention, for example, in the repetition of this romanticization in sort of ideas by Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, 1930s, and some would even argue the early ideas of Rastafarianism as well? Do we see a sort of repeated continuation of this romanticization of the African past, which would also say these early sort of Black intellectuals are thinking about Africa, are thinking about the African quote-unquote glorious past, but through Western epistemes of civilization, right? Which is why they pay attention, as you correctly put, into sort of the great kingdoms of ancient Africa. But this doesn't stop in the 19th century. It continues in the 20th century, especially through moments of serious political rupture within African-American history. In the 1960s and 1970s, you see also a repetition of this sort of intellectual tradition in the ideas of Sandra, for example, and Afrofuturism, which also gains entry into popular culture, the popular culture, African-American popular culture of the time, in funk music, in blaxploitation films. You continue to see this sort of reification of a particular kind of idea that African Americans have of Africa that is not quite at par with what Africa was at the time, but is really meant intellectually to sort of re-excavate the African past as a glorious past, but which is juxtaposed to the Black condition of being in America. Just your sort of, I'm curious about your thinking around these later intellectual projects that continue to do this work of romanticizing the African, the glorious African past. You also mentioned these sort of academic discussions that are taking place in HSBCUs, historically Black colleges, and in particular the intellectual paradigms that become quite popular not only towards the time of the scramble of Africa, the late 19th century, but also in the mid 20th century when most of Africa is decolonizing. These intellectual paradigms that divide the world, and in this case Africa, into a sort of race geography, right? So that the world is composed of particular races that have particular qualities that are also tied to particular geographies. It's also a spatial imagination as well, and much of Africa is also decolonized in this manner. Where these ideas were quite dominant and popular. Just for me, the question from that is how, during the late 19th century, how do these ideas, this intellectual paradigm, how does it relate to other projects such as, European scientific racism, eugenics, for example, which also really quite inform how Africa becomes colonized in the decades that follow. The Berlin Conference of 1885. So for me, I think like those two, it's a comment, it's also questions. If you could respond to that, if your work kind of deals with that, I'm curious if to hear your thoughts around that. So maybe a response to that, and then we could open the floor, or maybe Mwalimu, if you have additional points, I would welcome you. Do you want to respond to that, or should we open? Yeah. Okay. All right.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. I think I can use the mic, maybe. Sure. Can I this one? Okay. So, no, thank you so much for those questions. I really appreciate that. And I said this in the beginning, but I see more people have trickled in. So this is a project that is ongoing. So I think these questions really help push and clarify my thinking. So I think any and all clarifications, comments really help me. So thank you so much. And so I think my very short response is yes. These are things that I'm very, very interested in and I've thought about and want to think more of. And I think as I talk, what would be very helpful is if I could have the slides back. If I could go to, if I could go to, if you could first go back to slide number 2. It should be the one that says racial politics. Yes, thank you. Yeah, number 2. Yeah, so I'll just hang on there for a second. So to the question of the romanticization of the continent and these early traditions and the repetition, I have a lot of responses to that idea. And maybe how I respond won't be linear, because I think because these are dynamics that circulate, I think maybe it's okay if I don't go in a linear way. I think part of the problem with the contemporary, with my experience in the contemporary university today, is I don't necessarily know, and again, I can speak from the United States because that's my paradigm. I don't yet know that we've arrived at a way to talk about the continent that doesn't have the baggage of the 20th century. And what I mean by that is the baggage of, it's hard to talk about without bringing in a lot of context. So in the 1960s, actually, if you could please go to, because I think this will answer your question. If you could please go to slide number 6. Oh, excuse me, slide number 3, please. Okay, and this, I think, will take that up. So as I said in the very beginning of my remarks, something very interesting happens in the 1950s, right? From really the turn of the 20th century to the dawn of the Cold War, African studies is concentrated in the HBCU and is concentrated in popular Black neighborhoods, in Black public schools like M Street High School in Washington, D.C., where Carter G. Woodson taught before he goes to Howard, Marcus Garvey's popular arenas in Harlem. So that's really where the study of Africa is taking place. As the Cold War happens and as African communities and as diaspora communities sort of become a part of this global struggle for power, what happens is a transfer of the field from HBC, and transfer might even be a very pretty way of putting it. I would call it a blatant theft, because when you have money in the power of the State Department, you're not lifting anything, you're blatantly taking it. So when that field is taken to the universities, what happens is not only a change in how Africa is discussed in this sort of carved out racialized way, but what happens is a stripping of this tradition of Africa being a part of a larger popular history. Melville Herskovits, who was the founder of the program of African Studies at Northwestern, says very clearly in 1957, scholarship has to be neutral. Scholarship has to be objective. Civil rights has no place in the academy. So when you have this idea that the public doesn't matter, what ends up happening is Africa goes from being this place where human beings live to being this laboratory for research. And that is a dynamic that I don't think has changed. And so part of this question, I think this addresses the question of romanticization, is part of what also happens this period is the transfer of African studies by being the domain of historians to being the domain of anthropologists. And why that matters is because historians look at historical actors. Historians by definition look at change. Historians by definition, at least the good ones, don't think of society as an individual, as being stuck, but as being dynamic and as being people who respond to change. When you have, and this is the same thing in the UK, if you look at the very first cohort of the African Studies Association in the United Kingdom and the African Studies Association in the United States, the thing that's kind of striking to me, they're all anthropologists, right? I don't want to throw the field under the bus, but by definition, what they're looking at is people who are bound by culture, people who are stuck, people who are of superstition. How I think this relates in part to the question of romanticization is I think as a response to that, and this addresses your point of the continuation, I do think as a sort of visceral response to that, there is this desire to say, well, no, we're not just people in farms. We're people who built the great pyramids of Egypt. We built the temples of great Zimbabwe. You know, we did the Swahili urban villages, urban societies. We did all this. And I think it is, and I don't think I don't think there's a stigma in saying this. I think it is a very deep and emotional response to what I think is a very racialized way and a very ideological way of thinking and writing and speaking of the continent. So this, for context, is also what's happening here. I think you brought up Rastafarianism, and I think that's a very, bless you, a very interesting example, because I think I think part of this history is the movement of people and the movement of ideas. Ngala mentioned Marcus Garvey. Garvey begins his career in the UK with Dusay Muhammad Ali, who was a Black Egyptian living and working in the UK and sort of creating the diasporic community there. By the time Marcus Garvey gets to Harlem in 1917, I believe, he's already been inundated with these ideas of Ethiopia and Egypt, both through his religious teaching. Garvey was a zealot, a religious ideologue in every sense of the word, a religious fundamentalist with ideas of Ethiopia and Egypt as a proxy for Africa. So by the time he gets to New York, he already has a mass following of the peasant population in St. Croix and in Jamaica, and a following of sort of growing Pan-Africanism in the UK. So part of how I think these traditions survive is through the circulation circulation of ideas, the circulation of people, the rise of print journalism. Before Garvey gets to New York, he's already founded a black newspaper. And so this tradition, and I think you're right, is not limited to the 19th century. There are all sorts of ways in which it resonates, good and bad, that it resonates into the 20th century. The 60s and the 70s is incredibly important because what you see as a response to, so for context, in 1957, in 1969, 7 years after the African Studies Association in the United States is formed at Northwestern, and as it's very, very obvious that resources will be concentrated in very expensive private schools, that those who will get resources to do fieldwork in Africa will be concentrated in these schools, Black academics at public colleges throughout the United States begin to wage an assault. In 1969, one such assault happens at the convening of the African Studies Association in Montreal, where Black academics, and this newspaper clipping here is taken from there, ASA meeting disrupted by racial crisis. The racial crisis they're responding to is the exclusion of African Americans, people of African descent, from the study of Africa. What they argued was not only that they had a right to study who they were on their own terms, but they also had an obligation to talk about themes that were not being addressed in this anthropology sort of, and also political science, because to your point, this is also the period of decolonization. So this emphasis on nation state building, this emphasis on culture eclipses this prior concern with historical change over time. So as a way of responding to that, and we can talk more about the good and the bad of what this ended up doing for this question of romanticization, this cohort actually goes back to this tradition, and they say we have to talk about the pyramids because that's evidence that we've changed over time. We have to talk about the great pyramids of the great mounds of Zimbabwe because that shows that we're people of ingenuity. And I think, again, it's uneven, but it is a response to what they consider to be a very sort of limited academic terrain. At the same time, what's also happening is the rise of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement in the 70s, and how particularly it manifests itself culturally. You have the rise of Black television, you have the rise of Black sitcoms, you have the rise, and I'm repeating what you said, you brought it up beautifully, you have the rise of Black popular culture. And as African Americans, and I don't want to speak too much of this, I think there are people who can speak more insightfully to this particular topic than I can, but I think as African Americans are forming this new identity in the era of sort of mid-20th century emancipation, I do think it's interesting that they're going back to Africa and using that as the basis of this new African American identity in the context of freedom. This is where Swahili becomes the language of Kwanzaa. This is where Rastafarianism begins to articulate itself, Sun Ra, and like the beginning of Afrofuturism. So what's kind of fascinating to me is that for African Americans, building a future was about going to the past. And so I think that kind of popular realm and the new access that Black people have to technology, to media, to these popular spaces, I think helps sort of keep these ideas, however problematic or not they may be, I think keep them alive and also introduce them to another generation. And I think, yes, this sort of contradiction between Africa as a place of civilization and not being a sort of contemporary dynamic place that's grappling with issues of imperialism, I think this is where class really begins to articulate itself. And if I could please go to slide number 8, please, the one that says 20th century architects. So one of the things that I think is interesting, I'm still teasing out sort of what this means in my own work as this develops. Carter G. Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, to a certain extent, William Leo Hansberry, are people who were very hyper-educated, even as they were coming up in an era of extreme sort of limitations on Black mobility. All of them went to Harvard. All of them had their PhDs. They had very incredibly terrible experiences there, to be certain, but they were able to ascend to a particular class ladder. By the time that Du Bois becomes a part of the African-American sort of intellectual tradition, he'd already spent 2 years in Berlin studying philosophy. He comes back to the United States, begins a professorship, and becomes the go-to intellectual for the next sort of several decades. This is to say that there's a very particular, I think, aesthetic that he's exposed to, a very sort of particular idea about history, who's a worthy historical actor, what's a worthy narrative that's worth being uplifted. And I think this sort of class consciousness does inform their work. What happens what begins to happen in the 19 teens is the growth of a sort of Black proletariat in the urban cities. And I want to highlight just two people. There are many more I could highlight, but just to sort of talk about two people, and I think this addresses the question of romanticization. Hubert Harrison and Arturo Schomburg differ significantly from Du Bois, from Woodson, from Hansberry in that they're working class. Well, number one, they're immigrants. They're coming from poor working class communities in Jamaica. In the case of Schomburg, he's coming from Puerto Rico. They find themselves in poor neighborhoods in Brooklyn, like Bushwick, Harlem, and they create a public that is very much like them, non-literate, complicated relationship with the church, and people who, because they are non-literate, need new ways of incorporating information. One of the things that I think is really interesting about Marcus Garvey is that he was a performer, right? I mean, if anyone has seen photos of him, he's got the regalia, he's got the hat and the sword. This idea of performance becomes really important. And so rather than going to the university and engaging with that demographic, they're creating a new public in the streets. I would submit that because they are working class people who are dealing with the contemporary realities of racism, but also imperialism, because of these Caribbean colonies, their concern very much is with political economy, with the fact that Africa might be this grand civilization, sure, but it's also being besieged by the imperial project. So part of why I think this cohort of working class scholars working outside the university is so important is because they really challenge the orthodoxy. At this point, Du Bois is a very interesting figure because he's producing scholarship on Africa for 60 years. But in the beginning, he's very much a conservative. He's very much opposed to militant politics. When he goes to the UK to convene the Pan-African Congress, he's very clear he wants nothing to do with Garvey. By 1922, he's writing essays called Africa for the Africans, which, for those who don't know, is Garvey's sort of trademark. And so the way that these working class scholars are pushing these figures in the academy and basically saying, hey, like, pay attention to what's happening in the streets. Pyramids are fine, but pay attention to what's happening in the streets, not just here, but abroad, I think is really interesting and provides like a really sort of dynamic space. One final thing I want to say is the question of how the 19th century sort of relates to these other projects. Part of what's also happening is the rise of philanthropy. And how the rise of philanthropy, as I'm on a Fulbright, so we know how complicated that can be, getting money from the government and the way you have to frame your project for such. But what ends up happening during this time is the rise of the concept of philanthropy for research. The people who are in charge of philanthropy, people like Andrew Carnegie, for example, are also people who are imbibed with these very sorts of condescending and very sort of patronizing ideas of Africa. In 1906, Carnegie goes to, I believe, Edinburgh and delivers a whole speech about how the best education for the subaltern, for Indians, for Africans is a technical education, that Africans should not be given a liberal arts education, but should learn how to use their hands, right? And so I think part of the other story of this period is the story of, I think, sort of where money is flowing, how money is dictating who, not necessarily who can say what, but sort of how they can say it. So I know that was a very sort of all over the place way of responding to it, but yeah, thank you.
Yes, and if I was to add, just stand there because we'll be taking questions. If I was to add, I'll just say that in the UK where I studied, African studies departments also bear origin quite directly, actually, from the colonial project. When you think about, the British colonial project toward Africa or French colonial project, where administrators also almost play this double role between anthropologists and administrator at the same time. Some of the earliest written histories of communities in Kenya, for example, are written by colonial district commissioners, for example, and this sort of practice, I think ends in the academy when the European colonial project is folding in the 60s, becomes African studies. So I just wanted to add that. at the point. So I think we'll take a round of questions. What, 3, 4? Maybe 4, okay. So I usually like going to the back just for inclusivity, but no hand so far. Okay, go with you. So you state your name and.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Good evening. I'm Stephen. I graduated last year, Bachelor of Economics and Statistics. And I was much curious to attend this presentation, and which there's an area which I admired a lot is on the prophecy of African awakening. And also you mentioned a verse in the book of Psalms. So I was not aware of that. So my question is, in what key areas, areas such as corruption, management of resources, servant leadership, or political autonomy or cultural diversity, can African demonstrate its second awakening? And then lastly, you mentioned on the rise of the Black Church. So my question on that will be, what role did the Black Church play in preserving and promoting African American culture and identity that time? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question.
Should I just take more and then combine those?
Great. Thank you so much.
A second question.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. I like to draw. Oh, sorry. I think I'm recovering from flu. That's why I'm a bit in a rush. My name is Oscar Otel. I'm currently chairing the Department of Political Science and Public Administration here at the University of Nairobi. This is a concern that I raised in relation to your presentation on the legacy, this legacy of the African studies. Promotion. For African Studies Association. I was there in December, and in our informal gathering, I was asking my colleagues, why have we taken 20 hours to fly all the way from Africa to America? Why can't we have these meetings in one of the African capitals? So who is advancing, whose interest is being behind this association? I usually admire African studies, and we have a lot of connections with them. But also I see them as having what I will call some secret agenda. Things are not open. So as Africans, especially now the African scholars, we are left on the periphery of those engagements. So I know you. How long have you stayed in the US? You are born there?
No, I was born here.
Oh, you are born, so you migrated there. So how long have you stayed there?
25, more than 25 years.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you could probably help us to understand how we are seen there, so that we can perhaps understand ourselves better. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. I can take 2 more, yeah?
Thanks. My name is Gona. I'm the chair of History Department. Now, I think Oscar was talking about, close to what you're talking about, the development of hegemony. It looks like that hegemonic relationship is still on, with the African Studies Association. But my question, what was the outcome of the attack by the Black professors, when after the formation of the African Studies Association, mentioning Philip Catton? What was the outcome, right? Again, it goes back to what Oscar was saying. There was an attack there, but it seems the African Studies Association still continues. So what are the relationships? Thank you.
All right. Do you want to respond to those?
Yeah, I would love to.
Yep.
Yeah. Stephen, thank you for being here. So to your first question, I was going to make a joke. One of my professors in the States, I'm going to cheat my way out of that question. He says, as a historian, he can't predict the future. So I'm going to no, I'm just kidding. I'll address your first question first about the church. And then I have some ideas about your second question about the African awakening. So the church, to answer your question, was a really dynamic space because it was, and again, the missions were so intertwined. They were social spaces, places where people could gather. They were educational spaces, particularly for the freeborn population who weren't literate. They were these radical spaces where people were sort of developing ideas of rebellion. And at the heart of that was this idea. And it's really interesting, like, at least I'll speak for myself as a student of history, training to be a historian. It's always humbling when I read old texts to really get a sense of how close spatially that period was. Because if you're talking about the 19th century, you're talking about maybe just two generations of people, in some cases, maybe have memories of being taken from the continent to the Americas. And so in that sense, when I read it, for me, a light bulb goes off like, oh, of course they would be concerned with the African continent, because in a very sort of real sense, and maybe it's different in 2025, but in maybe 1856, in a very sort of real way, that's home, or that's something that has a different resonance. And so when I read those texts, it begins to make sense. Okay, like I get why this is foundational. Whether the foundation is trying to remember, whether it's really actually remembering and wanting to go back. So the way that they kept it alive, I think, in some ways, is through memory. I think through storytelling. And there's also a very early tradition of writers. I mean, I mentioned the Haitian writer Baston Vassy, but even prior to that, you have people of the diaspora writing about the Haitian Revolution, and early newspapers in the early 19th century sort of deriving inspiration from that and saying, oh, do you see that? Like, that's what we could do here. And so I think these global events, the rise of literature, the church is very much at the forefront of it, also because a lot of these clergy who were in charge of churches were themselves incredibly well educated. Reverend Carmel actually got his degree at Cambridge before he began his career as a missionary in Liberia. So these are incredibly hyper educated and very well traveled men at this point. And I say men because I would love for someone to ask a question about how gender figures into this, because I think it does figure in a very interesting way. With the African awakening, I want to kind of tackle that because I think, Professor, it's related to what you're, and I'm so glad you brought this up. I could do a whole lecture on that as well, and my frustrations with basically what you brought up about like the farce of having to go there. And so I want to kind of answer these two together. There's also a question about the legacy of African studies and going to the States and sort of like the hegemony of that. And I think you brought this up, that in some ways the hegemony really hasn't changed, to answer sort of these questions together. So what happens after the 1960s is there's actually another protest at the ASA, this time in 1971 in Los Angeles, with the same group of actors. This one is a lot bigger. It's a lot more militant, a lot less, as we would say, respectable. And it galvanizes the sort of Euro-American guard to really have to respond to them. So a meeting is convened between the insurgent academics, people like John Henry Clark, who was teaching at I believe, Hunter College, a small working class institution in New York City, and these sort of academic gatekeepers to really sort of chart like the future of African studies. How can we sort of meet each other halfway? For all sorts of reasons, these conversations really break down. And they really break down over what Professor's alluding to, this question of leadership. The question of visas is never addressed. For those who have had the indignity of having to get a visa to travel, the question of visa regimes is never addressed. The question of equitable funding is never addressed. Me and my colleague Ian are here under a State Department fellowship, which is a broader sort of part of the legacy of Title VI, which gives scholars in the United States money to go study a foreign language, money to conduct field work. The top 5 producing schools, and I hesitate to say this because I'm not sure of the order, but we're basically schools like Northwestern, schools like Indiana, schools like Boston, schools like Wisconsin. The lion's share of federal funding goes to these schools. There's a very particular demographic that is at these schools. There's a very particular demographic that is not at these schools. The question of what I'm saying is the question of racial leadership is never seriously taken into account. So the question then becomes, okay, we want to meet each other halfway, but if we're not going to even compromise on the very basic issues, which is who gets to study Africa, who's getting the money to do it, and what you're saying, then there's no partnership. So to answer your question, what ends up happening is a split. The Black professors create what's called the AHSA, the African Heritage Studies Association, which is basically Black scholars, and the ASA continues basically as it is. There have been attempts over the years to address what they call the racial invisibility. I would submit that in many important ways, they have fallen short. I brought up Philip Curtin because Philip Curtin in 1995 authored a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education titled Ghettoizing African Studies, in which he argued that Black people in scholarship lower the standards of academic practice. To the credit of a lot of people in the field, there was a lot of pushback, but at the same time, what does it say that the man who is the founder of arguably one of the most important African history programs in the country, Wisconsin, would hold on to values like that and feel so emboldened to articulate them in such a public forum? So this is the legacy that continues today. I have so many colleagues. I had a colleague of mine in Uganda. She's someone who's more of a public scholar, so doesn't work quite in the university, and had a paper of hers read in the United States and went to the consulate in Kampala and couldn't get a visa to come to the States. So I think part of the awakening, part of your question, part of the hegemony, and just pointing out the craziness of this, I think it's so difficult because I think in some ways I'm in this position as well, where I'm born here, my family's from Mombasa, I was born in Nairobi, so my roots are very much here, and this in a way is a homecoming, and it's this thing of I think commitment. I think so much of what I've gotten from being in this department is the difference between being an intellectual tourist and really being embedded in the department. That's why I'm always nagging you. I'm just like, I want to sit in on your class. I want, because I think I've really understood that there's a difference between visiting and a difference between like really embedding yourself and getting a sense of, how people are thinking, what they're writing about. I had a crazy experience where, as you alluded to, my project is on Ngoma and performance on the coast. And I had tracked down a professor in Tanzania whose book is basically everything I'm writing about. It's called Tamthilia ya Kiswahili. So it's like, Kiswahili theater. And I remember I had this moment where I was like, this is literally what I'm studying. And I cannot think of a single scholar in the States who has cited his work. And I emailed him. He's at the University of Dar es Salaam. Very, very nice guy. He was very, very gracious. He gave me a copy of the book. And he said, it's out of print because the publisher that I was using went out of business. So there are questions of inequality. And this is kind of your point. It's like there are issues of mismanagement, issues of what we value, where money is going, resources. All of these things are tied together, and it creates this kind of apartheid and this kind of almost like comedic state of affairs where you have an African studies institution in the United States that really, I don't know. I mean, how much of a genuine relationship they have with the African continent. I'm always the student asking why are the scholars we're citing in our books not based in Africa, or if they are based, it's one or two. So I think these are dynamics that persist today. And maybe part of your question is that it might require people being less polite and maybe sacrificing professional relationships and really asking these difficult questions about leadership, about money, about resources. So I'll say that.
All right, we'll take a second round of questions, and not forgetting those who have joined us online. So if there's questions there. We will take. Maybe Dr. Mbongi has a question. Mwalimu, you may need to unmute your speaker. Well, you may need to unmute. We cannot hear you. Could we take a question from the floor as we sort out the technical issues? Yes, Mwalimu Kiule.
Asante sana. Kambi and Ngala, wonderful presentation. I don't know whether what I have are questions or comments, but I'm just wondering, in those early 18 teens and 20s, what was the key or main source of information for these, what you're calling early scholars?
Yeah.
And then secondly, what do you think was the key driver for them to appropriate, Western Christianity instead of, doing something African?
Yeah.
Then third is in the early 60s, the OAU started a project that led to what has now come to be known as the UNESCO General History of Africa. One of the key reasons for that was to correct, so to speak, all these, what Ngala is calling, what did you call it? Romanticization of African history and heritage, which, according to you, I think all those guys you have mentioned will be the culprits. To what extent do you think the GHA has corrected this? And do you think there is more that may need to be done?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I'll start with the first part, and I'm really glad you brought that up. And I think this is a part of the contradiction in terms of earlier I talked about sort of imagining Africa and these sort of imaginings. So to answer your question, a lot of what they're using is methods that were available to them. A lot of them are using the testimony of the ancients. So Herodotus, Homer, Hubert Harrison is collecting, and this is actually this is interesting because this is also the scholarly dilemma, right? Is that in a way we're using similar archives, but we interpret them differently. So for Hubert Harrison, he's reading the work of Herbert Spencer. He's reading the work of eugenicists, and he's sort of contradicting that by what Homer and Herodotus are saying. So what's interesting about this period, and also specifically with Harrison, he's reading voraciously newspapers. I mean, his focus was less on civilization and more on imperialism. So he's reading newspapers, he's reading Life magazine, he's looking at the work of foreign correspondents to really get a sense of how hegemony is articulating itself in Africa in the present. As far as the past, I think this is the interesting contradiction, is I think he's beholden to this tradition that he's also trying to undermine, and so I think that's a dilemma that I think maybe as scholars we wrestle with today, is sort of how we use the archives, how can we, how do we sort of fairly interpret them? Like, are we reinforcing things? Are we challenging them? So it's this interesting position that they find themselves in. In terms of the UNESCO, this maybe is a great segue to talk about gender. And I also want to preface, I also want to say this. There's nothing wrong with studying African antiquity. I just want to be clear about that. There's nothing fundamentally wrong. If your academic and intellectual interest is ancient Egypt, that's fine. If it's the Sudan or Songhai, that's absolutely fine. The issue is not what people study necessarily. I think the issue is the terrain, and how does the terrain shape what is studied, right? I think in an ideal way, we would be able to tell these sort of long durée histories and like really chart change. I mean, my interest, as I've mentioned to Professor Gona, is actually looking at pre-colonial history myself, because I'm very much interested in the movement of peoples, how societies come into being, how they change and why. So the focus in antiquity is not the problem. I think it's more sort of this larger question of how do you do that in a framework where these epistemologies are hegemonic, these tools that we're using aren't necessarily ours, right? And when you have to fit into, you know, like I'm getting ready to start my PhD in the fall, and it's just like it'll be interesting. I mean, at a certain point, I'm gonna have to read the literature of the field. I'm gonna have to defend my perspectives. So there's a way in which I can't ignore that tradition. There's a way that even if I want to or not, it's going to act on me, right? So I mean, I think these questions of like, you know, how do you find autonomy in these spaces is an ongoing question. So I don't know if anyone is familiar with what he's referencing. But it was in the 70s, right? So in the mid 20th century, UNESCO convened what was called the General History of Africa, and it was a very ambitious multi-decade project, which was basically charting African history from the discovery of the hominids. If the project was done in the 20th century, probably through the end of colonialism, so the anti-colonial movements, a very ambitious project, which took decades and decades to finally finish. And it's, I mean, I think it's actually quite impressive, the scope and the range. I think one of the volumes, volume 1, talks about methodology, and they talk about oral history, linguistics. Sheikh Anta Diop, this is when he's coming into prominence, talks about his method. So it's a very ambitious piece of work that I think really, you know, does its stated mission, which is to really talk about Africa as a place of history, as a place of historical diversity, and a place of historical change. One of the critiques that has been made, and I want to frame it as that because I actually didn't even notice this myself, but as a response to the UNESCO General History, African women academics wrote their own book called I think it's called Women Writing Africa. And the reason they did that is because out of 8 volumes written over the course of many decades, there's not a single woman writer featured in that 8-volume series. And so I think there's a lot of sort of, I think the series of volumes has done a tremendous amount of work. But again, this question of invisibility articulated itself. And one of the points that was made in one of the volumes of Women Writing Africa was gender plays a role even in what we consider, even in what we understand to be something worthy of study. And so one particular writer, I think she's Ugandan, made the point that even the emphasis on kings and queens and states is itself a masculinist history. Because she says you leave out the ordinary people. In African studies, we talk about the Iron Age in African history, where people are smelting iron, and she says, that's true. That's a piece of technology, but pottery is also technology, and pottery is a dynamic field that is also growing at this particular time. And so, why don't we call it the Pottery Age? Why do we call it the Iron Age? Right. So part of why I think it is important to talk about gender in the context of history writing is because I think it alerts you to your blind spots and to things that you emphasize or things that you de-emphasize. And so I think that the legacy of UNESCO is very complicated, very uneven, but definitely something that I think is very welcome in this project of looking at Africa as a place of history and historical diversity.
So we are really running out of time. I don't know if the issues have been sorted because you want to be inclusive. Kefa?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I actually texted my question. So help just by reading. Thank you. Can you read my question at the chat? I just texted my question so that I can save on time as well.
Kefa, postgraduate student at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. Question 1. Borrowing from Ali Mazrui, African triple heritage, we do know religion, especially Christianity, was used by the slave masters as an instrument for unhardening the hearts. Into brackets, make not resist, of the African slaves, and same was in Africa, a highway for the imperialist project, in brackets, as seen with the King Leopold letter to the Congo Free State missionary, to see Africans submit as borrowed from Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, slave survival to the master. What, could you scroll down, please? What do you say of the Africanization of Christianity as the same Christian lens was hailed the Hamitic hypothesis? Yeah. Question 2, did this dilemma trigger Malcolm X to the path of Mohammedan attempt to find religion for all? Asante.
I think I really, thank you. I really appreciate the questions. Should I just answer one by one?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I really struggled to sort of complicate my own ideas about religion in African history. I think in the beginning of my schooling, I think I had a very sort of condemning view of it, but at the same time, like I'm learning to find. I think part of taking African agency seriously, I think. Part of taking African agency seriously is taking seriously the concept of appropriation and translation. I feel like the word appropriation, at least in the States where I live, has a sort of negative connotation when I don't think it should. I think it's a creative practice, right? I mean, and even I think the whole concept of Christianity as a European phenomenon itself can be complicated, right? And so I don't know if it's the religion itself or religiosity itself, but I mean, again, the idea of the terrain and how ideas are used. And I hope I'm answering your question satisfactorily. But to your second point, I would say yes. And in fact, there's a really interesting scholar by the name of Michael Gomez who wrote a brilliant book about Islam among diasporic communities. And one of the points he makes is that what begins to happen, I don't know when he charts the beginning of this phenomenon, but he makes the argument that over time, Islam becomes regarded as the language of the religion of liberation for African Americans, and Christianity is the religion of subjugation. And he sort of looks at, as the reason, one of the points he makes is that what's Malcolm's organization? I'm blank. This is embarrassing. Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam becomes, one of the largest, most consequential movements, and the sort of the language of militancy that they sort of deployed as like as a counterpoint to what they felt was more of an accommodationist politics. So yeah, I think absolutely ideas about Christianity and subjugation, I absolutely do think played a role in the growth of and the embrace of Islam, particularly among working class communities in Detroit, and where the UNIA and the Nation of Islam really took root, and also in New York as well.
I would like to give again a chance to Professor Kenneth Ombongi, because he raised his hand quite early. Maybe it's a problem. Computer, Mwalimu. We could try Mary Wanyoike, whose hand is also up. But I would advise Mwalimu Ombongi to maybe restart your machine if you can, and if we'll still be here. But Mary Wanyoike, I think you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you, Kambi, for that very interesting topic and discussion. Mine is, I think, a comment, and I'm particularly interested in the role of the church in conscious building among the African Americans. And I see it as paradoxical at times, where the church builds the consciousness of the African Americans so that they are also able to push forward and struggle for their rights. And that takes us all the way to the days of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Then we also see the church at the beginning, in the early days of slavery, abetting slavery itself, and therefore furthering an anti-African American cause, furthering the oppression of the Africans. I find that a bit paradoxical in the African American studies. Then I also want to bring in the church, the African church, the role of the African church, and the African religious experiences and their contribution to the African American liberation. And I heard you talk about Haiti, and we know the role of Bordeaux in the Haiti revolution. So would you tell us something more about this religious aspect? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, Professor. I mean, I think it's a really contradictory history, and where I've arrived at in my research, and I think I'm still growing in this topic and still developing it. I think, you know, it's interesting because one of the things I'm learning is that communities obviously shift over time. And one of the things that's happening in the States right now, I think, you know, maybe not exactly the same, but not too dissimilar from the Gen Z uprising happening in Kenya, is the way in which people are carving out new spaces for themselves and imagining sort of like new communities that can incorporate them. And I think particularly in 2016, and this relates to what you're saying, one of the very interesting things that I saw happening was this demographic and ideological split between those who were millennials and Gen Z in the general election of 2016 versus those who were boomers, or if you will, where you had, I think, I don't know of the numbers, so I won't say, but a significant number of those two generations, the Gen Z and the millennials, really going for the sort of insurgent candidate, and those sort of going, those older going for like more of the sort of established figure. And I use that as an example to make a broader point that I think, you know, number one, there's always cleavages within communities, and then the communities always change. So even when we say something like the Black community, I've actually stopped using that phrase because I think it obscures more than it actually reveals. I've touched on the issue of class a little bit. I've touched on the issue of gender. And so I think more productive questions as we sort of look at this idea of the contradictory role of the church is not, you know, the Black community, but, you know, what was that community like in 1895? How important was the church to community building in the era of segregation? How important was it when Black people can now gain access to sectors of life that they were shut out of? What's the role of the church when opportunities for formal education sort of open up? What's the relationship of the church in the South? What's the relationship of the church where people migrate to the North, right? So I think that maybe this is an indirect way of answering your question. Maybe it's just more engaging with what you're saying. But I think for me, I've sort of moved away from singular ways of looking at communities and thinking about more sort of pluralistic ways we can talk about groups, because I think there's always going to be differentiation. And I don't want to speak about the African sort of church as much, because that has not been as much a part of my purview as I want it to be. I think that's something I'd love to learn more about in conversations with people here. So.
All right, yeah. So I think we can try Mwalimu one last time, because we are really out of time, and then I'll give my mic to the chair to close the session.
Can you hear me now? Dr. Ngara, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Mine first, I could like to express my very sincere gratitude to Kambi for joining us and delivering such an excellent presentation at the early stages of his PhD journey, which I will want to wish you Kambi success. Now, I have a small question regarding an article that the Ghanaian historian Emmanuel Champong in Harvard wrote in African Affairs in the late 90s. In this article, Champong discusses the often very romanticized view that African Americans, both academics and everyday individuals, hold about Africa. And he suggests that these idealized perceptions tend normally to dissipate quickly when they visit the continent and are confronted with its challenges from wars, violence, hunger, disease, and drought. Now, given your work on this historical reclamation of Africa and Africanness, I could be interested to know how you think these romanticized perceptions have influenced, the thinking of Africa among academics, whether it is probably what you can classify as negative or positive, or does the reality of the continent as experienced by some African Americans challenge the efforts of fostering a more nuanced understanding of Africa's past and present? That's a small one. It's not a very serious one, but thank you very much. I was not able to attend this presentation physical as I could have wished. I'm involved in an exercise of student elections. And for the last few days, it has been quite hectic. Today, it was very interesting. I'm quote unquote being visited by students. So we are actually conducting this exercise. Visiting means they are really agitated over the delays that we have had. So that's why I thought while I'm doing this exercise, I can attend this online. But welcome to the university. Welcome to the department. Thank you very much. Maybe I send that question.
Go ahead.
I'll try and do this very quickly, but a couple of things. So I think one, like, as a person of the diaspora who lives in the States, I think this just is a function of like the communities that I've been a part of. I've always benefited, and I think in many ways, I'm also an artist, like artistically, and also like as a scholar in training. I've always been shaped, I think, by that legacy of diasporic engagement, whether it's Afrofuturism. My background is in dance and theater, so the particular dance styles that I've done, and so for me, in a way, it's that legacy that brought me to graduate school. So for me in my life, it's been something that's been incredibly productive and something that I'm really excited about. I love it when my friends in the States ask me questions about where I'm from. I think it inspires me to study my own history more deeply so that I can share with them more critically. I was very intentional about like wanting to come back home, to do my Fulbright, and to really be here in a way that allowed me to, be intimate, with the surroundings and, not be here as a tourist, but like really be here as somebody who's learning. And I think this, and something I want to say very quickly, I know we're out of time, but this dichotomy between what you imagine and then what the reality is, I think that's a real dynamic. What I would say is that I think there's an idea that is an issue that has to do with Black diaspora. And what I want to submit is that that's something that has to do with modernity, right? And what I mean by that is I'll share a very small anecdote. Many, many, many years ago, I had a friend who is Korean. She was adopted by a white Jewish family in Minnesota, grew up in Minnesota, and when she was 18, hired a private investigator to track down her biological mother. I think at one point she even stopped using her given name and used what she imagined was her ethnically Korean name, started taking Korean, and went to Korea, I think with this idea of like, I'm coming home, I think only to realize that the reality, to Professor Mbaghi's point, was much more complicated, you know? And so I think this idea that you imagine something and then you go, whether that imagination is you think I have this ancestral connection, I'm home, only to be confronted with something much more dynamic. And it's not negative. I don't think it's negative. Like, I mean, the joke with me is like, I speak Swahili, but everybody on the coast is like, wewe, lahaja ni inatafa. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's very obvious I sound different, even though I speak the language. So I don't think I don't think that this confrontation is negative. I mean, I think we're running into the legacy of imperialism, the legacy of modernity, like what it means to be taken away, and then however many generations back somebody goes. And I think it can be an opportunity for something very productive. I think I don't know what ended up happening with that friend of mine. I hope that it led her to, you know, I don't know, have a different relationship with me. It's led me to engage in a different way. So I think this tension between what you imagine and then what you see is very real. I think it's, you know, up to me to determine how I respond to that. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll ask Dr. Ben and Choga to give us a vote of thanks. So as we conclude this afternoon session, thank you. This one on. Okay, fine. Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Dr. Ben Choga. Quite a number of people know me around. I'm happy to be given this chance to give a vote of thanks, and I will start by congratulating the presenter today. We have learned something. And we are happy. I think one thing I learned is that America, or the Americas, has been brought very close to Africa. I saw you display some graphics here, showing two people, like very close and greeting each other. I'm not a historian per se, but I was so happy about that. And the other thing I have learned this evening, and I'm happy about, is that you have actually enlightened me and perhaps the rest of us about intellectual history. I don't know whether I'm being precise and to the point. I've heard of intellectual history, but I've not gone to a class of intellectual history. But when I was sitting there, I said, this must be intellectual history from the way things are unfolding. I also want to thank our head of department, you know, Dr. George Gona, my senior. I respect him so much for actually taking a step ahead in, you know, putting our department in that historical map we deserve. And Chairman, we are behind you on this. You have put it very well from our former chairman, Dr. Mbongi. I also want to thank my young upcoming scholar, Ngala. Ngala, you know, when he was a student here, I didn't know that you could go this far. You looked like, you know, this guy is, I don't want to mention that, but you know how you look like, isn't it? So it's very good. You know, as we are aging now, there's a time when I was young, we are aging and we are happy to see people coming up. I want to thank my colleagues and also students. My colleague Kule is there. He has really mentored me, by the way. You may not know Kule. He's the one who talked. He's very knowledgeable. He's very, very knowledgeable. He was my teacher and he has taken me places. I want to thank the guests who have come. Those I don't know directly, but I know you could not have just found yourself here. There is a reason why you came here. And we are in convergence as far as our thinking is concerned. To our studio, gentlemen here, I need to call this a studio from the way things are arranged here. I can see several cameras, several points of wiring and all that. You are doing a great job. And therefore, really, I really don't have much to say. I don't want to give stories. If I give stories, I'll go beyond and beyond the time that is allocated to me. So thank you very much. We hope that we'll carry on as it has been our tradition and let's always attend. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you so much.